Racism can exist without malice, without individual intent, and without a villain. It operates on 4 different levels: internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. So when we think about racism, often what people go to are individual acts of meanness, right? And the measure for whether or not racism is operating in organizations is often whether or not people are nice to each other. And so there's this sense that, well, everyone here is nice to each other, so there's no racism. And we have to dig a little bit deeper. Internalized racism lives within us, right? It is the way in which we internalize beliefs about ourselves and about other people, about groups that we're a part of and about groups that others belong to. So if what we're internalizing is superiority, then we see ourselves as better than other groups of people. If what we're internalizing is inferiority, then we see ourselves as less than other groups of people. And we see that play out for people of color, for Black folks in particular, around things like stereotype threat, where we at an unconscious level buy into this idea that we're intellectually inferior and that other people, other groups of people of color, white people, are superior to us. Again, not necessarily at a conscious level, but at that unconscious level, and it has deep and abiding impacts. Interpersonal racism operates between people. And this is the form of racism that we are most familiar with. Right? When we think about racism, we think about hate crimes, and we think about racial jokes, and we think about physical altercations. In workplaces, what we see most often are racial microaggressions. This is a misnomer. A lot of times people think microaggressions are small. And so that's why they're called microaggressions. They're not small. They operate at an interpersonal level, and that's what makes them micro. But these are the death by 1,000 cuts kind of comments and behaviors that really negatively impact the person who's on the receiving end. And those are the things that just over time make our cultures toxic. Institutional racism operates through our policies and our practices. And, this is a moment where lots of organizations are looking at their policies and they're saying, have we written our policies in a way that doesn't consider the needs of the people who work here or of the people that we want to work here? And that is extremely important. But the other thing we have to look at is, what does the data tell us? If we disaggregate our data by race, what is the story that it tells us about how our institutional policies and practices are actually impacting different groups of employees within our organization, and how that is playing out if we are a school, how that's playing out with students and families, and if we're a nonprofit, how that's playing out with the communities that we serve. Structural racism, often described as societal racism or systemic racism, operates across institutions. So here is where we go from thinking about what's happening in a school to thinking about what's happening in education across the country. We go from thinking about what's happening in a hospital to thinking about what's happening in healthcare across the country. And here we continue to see, we can be looking at the Midwest, we can be looking at the West Coast, we can be looking at the South, and we see the same patterns operating for people of color, right? We see this in infant mortality as it relates to healthcare. We see this with maternal health. We also see this with the school to prison pipeline operating in our educational systems. And so this is where our history and our culture and all of those things converge to continue to produce these inequitable outcomes. The way that we use the 4 levels framework for us and for our clients is to really think about at what level do we want to intervene. So if we want to address an issue that's operating at the internalized level, that's going to be a very different approach than if we want to address something that's operating at the interpersonal or the institutional level. And so having an understanding of how the 4 levels operates supports us to do that and to use it as a tool for analysis and for strategy development. Once you understand the 4 levels of racism, you can push any ism through this framework. So whether you are thinking about sexism or ableism or heterosexism, all of them operate at all 4 of these levels: internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And once you understand that, you can begin to develop strategies and solutions that get to the heart of the challenges that we face.